A road runs east from the city like a white ribbon, dust rising in thin plumes with every cart and footfall. Mile markers lean from years of wind. In the distance, the Amphitheater crouches on the skyline, not merely a place for spectacle, but a stage tuned to humiliation. Tiers designed so a decree shouted from the podium would carry, sightlines cut to show, arches carved for the passage of shame. This is where private refusals were made public, where defeat was narrated as a lesson, and where people were paraded not only as captives, but as currency. You think public humiliation is a modern invention? Ancient Rome fashioned it into an instrument of governance, an economy, and a ritual. Over the next stretch, we will walk three parallel routes. A young mother who refused a ritual gesture and found her life measured in social credit. A captured foreign leader whose capture was turned into a triumphal performance. And the endless convoys of enslaved people whose passage through gates and markets amounted to an industry. These are jaw-dropping because they show humiliation engineered by law, by architecture, by commerce to do work for the state. And they are sobering because traces of these incidents survive in the most ordinary things. A wax tablet, a municipal ledger, a graffiti scratched on a wall that simply reads, "Remember." If preserving these stories matters, like or subscribe so they aren't lost. The house where Alia lived pressed close to its neighbor. Narrow rooms stacked like pages in a closed book. By lamp oil and the smell of drying clothes, she inscribed a small wax tablet with a trembling finger, the stylus leaving a shallow line. She refused what others took for granted. The palm laid on the altar, the gesture of civic piety meant to announce loyalty and submission to communal rights. To outsiders, such a refusal might have seemed trivial, a small omission in a crowd of daily observances. For Roman authorities, and for those whose social standing depended on conformity, refusal was noisy. It echoed. The punishment decreed for Alia did not begin with imprisonment or exile. It began with the market. An edict issued by a local magistrate listed penalties for neglect of ritual obligations. The language of the edict is, in parts, fragmentary, and some clauses survive only in later copies. But its mechanism is clear. Civic gestures were enforceable through economic sanctions and through public marking. Alia's head was shorn, not as an act of physical torture, so much as a sign worn in public. A placard, a wooden board with her name and an accusation, was hung in the forum. Her name was entered into municipal accounts as "in default of civic duties," a notation that would be quoted against her in transactions, rent arrangements, and market credit. Shame, translated into ledgers, rendered social life inhospitable. Imagine her at the market afterwards. Neighbors fall silent, stallholders excusing themselves. A butcher who had once smiled, now avoiding eye contact, as if the civic ledger had become a spell. Creditors cross her name off their lists. Where social trust had been the grease of daily exchange, that trust narrowed and stopped. The architectural setting amplified the act. In small towns, the civic altar sat near the main road. Pedestrians stopped. Oxen passed. The placard's placement was deliberate, where the widest number of eyes might fix on it. The city had engineered sightlines, the routes people took, the bench where mothers perched, the narrow path from the fountain, so that a public marking carried maximum weight. Humiliation, in this sense, was both ritual and infrastructure. We must be careful. The wax tablet found in a back room and attributed to Alia is reading partly through inference. Scholars debate whether the tablet is an exact personal record or a later copy made by a provincial clerk. The hand is shaky, and some lines are obliterated by wax reheating. Still, the tablet's existence, a small record of a refusal, is itself telling. That such a private object was made at all suggests that refusal was not only visible but anticipated. People kept records. They wrote names and deeds because the apparatus of shame could reach into paper and wax and hold. The household ledger algebraized human reputation. Across the city, a different choreography unfolded, the triumph. A captured leader, unnamed in the surviving role we can point to here with confidence, was bound and led past arches carved with gods and victories. His hands were not merely bound. Ropes were woven into a tableau. Servants and animals accompanied him in mockery of his former sovereignty. Crowns on the ground, thrones overturned, symbolic coins and trinkets flung into the crowd. The procession was, deliberately, a visual pedagogy. It taught the populace where power resided now and where it had been lost. The triumphant general did not simply announce dominance. He turned the defeated into a living parable. The triumph was a marketplace as much as it was a ritual. Stalls along the route hawked miniature plaques depicting the capture, small amphora painted with scenes from the conquest, and tokens engraved with the eye-catching image of a bound ruler. Craftsmen anticipated the procession weeks in advance. Contracts were drawn up for the supply of banners and the rental of carts. Vendors paid for privileged stalls where the best view would be. The state's victory translated into private profit. The humiliation performed by the prisoner became a commodity with its own downstream economy. Again, our sources are partial. We have accounts of triumphal routes and municipal contracts. A provincial clerk's later note lists payments to vendors for Nataval decorations, for a triumph whose exact date is debated. Coins struck in the years around the event are interpreted by scholars as tourist souvenirs, an argument not universally accepted. Yet the pattern is persistent enough across cities and decades to suggest that triumphs functioned routinely as both catechism and commerce. The state offered a spectacle, the market sold its memory. This is not merely symbolic. Economically, triumphs produced a ripple. Commodities were manufactured to satisfy the crowd's desire for relics. A child's toy coin, stamped with a scene of a bound foreign king, made the story portable. The parent who bought it brought the narrative into a home. The humiliation of a leader was thus reproduced in kitchens, courtyards, and neighborhood roads, long after the captive was taken to imprisonment or death. In some accounts, the prisoner survived the visual instrument of the triumph precisely because his continued existence as a living illustration was useful. To preserve him was to preserve the lesson. Between the private story of Alia and the public pageantry of the triumph runs a grimmer, more industrial route, the convoys of enslaved people. Lines of chained men and women were not incidental to military campaigns or urban life. They were organized and contracted. Municipal ledgers record costs, transportation, temporary holding pens, payments to private contractors who ferried people between estates and markets. A ledger entry in one provincial archive lists payments to a contractor for transfers of persons, with sums assigned and gates named. Another entry records receipts from an amphitheater's proprietor for the hire of a group of people described in neutral accounting language. Only later marginal notes make visible the human identities once attached. The convoys moved along routes that intersected with every kind of Roman space. Roads and bridges, river piers and city gates, market squares and amphitheater loading ramps. At each point there were nodes where merchants and local officials profited. Temporary corrals might appear just outside city walls, fenced places where the presence of people in bondage became visible to the urban populace. Vendors positioned themselves just beyond these pens, selling bread and cupfuls of wine to crowds that came to watch or simply to pass. Profit was taken at every step. Tolls charged to the transporters, bribes extracted at gates, fees for pens and guards. The humiliation that accrued to those in chains was thus not only judicial or military, it was financialized. The language in municipal ledgers is bureaucratic and clinical, and where names appear, they can be small windows into lives otherwise erased. One page records, in cramped letters, Lysanias, son of Demos,
A line scholars translate as an inventory listing, possibly of a person bought and sold, or perhaps recorded as missing in a census.
The reading of this name is interpretive. Some copies differ on spelling and context, and scholars debate whether we are seeing a sale, a transport record, or a note of debt. Even with those uncertainties, the ledger's texture matters. The anthill of entries, the columns that juxtaposed income and loss, the minor corrections scrawled in different hands. These are the things that, decades later, allow us to infer the routines that turned people into entries and entries into social erasure. The architecture of the city intersected with these processes. Roads were not neutral. Their surfaces and widths directed flows of bodies and sight. The amphitheater's loading ramps and service corridors favored quick exposure of a group to the crowd. Triumphal arches framed a captive's passage, forcing the viewer to see a particular narrative. Even the placement of official plaques and announcers' platforms choreographed attention. Whoever controlled the built environment controlled who was seen and who could whisper a counter-memory in the corners. But there were always margins where control frayed. In an alley behind a bakery, someone scratched a single word into plaster: remember. The scratched letters are faint. The context is contested. Was it solidarity, private grief, a plea from a family member? But their presence is striking. Graffiti appears irregularly across sites associated with public punishment. Some mark the event in anger, others in empathy. In one latrine wall, later recorded by municipal stoneworkers, a poem of sorts, fragmentary and likely added decades after the event, repeats names and questions. These marginal acts are small defiance. They are not state-run, they are not commodified, and they resist the official script. That resistance becomes clearer when we meet Marginalia, the ledger keeper. She is a later figure in our sequence, a woman who penned columns in a private household book that alternated between accounting and memory. Her ledger is double-sided. On one side, calculations, grain deliveries, payments to laborers, receipts for the purchase of textiles. On the other side, in a smaller, hurried hand, are lists of names and tiny notes. Song for the road, bread given to the fifth pen, Lysanias, remember. Marginalia's pages suggest an ethics of attention. Where official papers anonymized, she remembered. Where municipal accountants tallied costs and profits, she counted human names. We must be careful with Marginalia too. The identification of the ledger's author is reconstructed from a marginal inscription that a later reader connected to a public clerk named Marginalius. Some scholars think the name could be a later owner's annotation. Whether Marginalia was the original scribe or a subsequent reader, the ledger itself, with its crossnotes and scorings, preserves a practice. Names preserved side by side with debts. That juxtaposition is not accidental. It indicates that the act of accounting was sometimes an act of commemoration, that keeping track could be a form of bearing witness. Aaliyah's wax tablet, the Triumph's vendor lists, the convoy ledgers, and Marginalia's notebook together reveal a system that made public humiliation legible and transactional. The state did not always force shame by force of arms alone. It relied on the invisible muscles of commerce, of notation, of built sightlines. Humiliation functioned as pedagogy. It taught citizens their place. But it also functioned as profit. It fed markets and filled private hands with gain. The three narratives interlock. Aaliyah's placard on the forum was as much a notice to lenders as it was a moral rebuke. The captured leader's passage filled the city's pockets with the sale of narratives. The convoy's movement crossed space and market and law, reducing people to entries and then to commodity. Yet at the edges, memory resisted. A scratched "remember," a ledger side note, a song hummed by a child who had seen a triumph. These were the stitches that kept names from fading entirely. At the heart of these mechanisms were laws and edicts that made ritual observance enforceable. A magistrate's decree could stipulate penalties framed in terms of fines, denials of access to civic grain distributions, or public marking. In some provinces, such decrees survived in copies kept by clerks.
They are often late copies, and scholars warn us that wording may have shifted in transmission. Still, the pattern remains. Law authorized public marking, and municipal systems operationalized it. The law supplied the script. Local offices supplied the actors. Ritual choreography made the script legible. Consider the layout of a town square. The altar stood near the fountain, the magistrate's seat in clear view, the marketplace stretching out so that a placard could be seen by passers-by and traders alike. The practice of shaving the head before a crowd was not universally applied, but in recorded cases served a semiotic function. The act told neighbors this person has been cut off from social capital. The sight was as instructive as a posted edict. Markets completed the circuit. Vendors understood the value of visual stories. Craftsmen who made token trinkets. Metal workers who stamped commemorative medallions. Cloth sellers who produced banners engraved with victory motifs. All of these makers were economic partners in the production of spectacle. Contracts between amphitheater proprietors and municipal councils sometimes included stipends for actors, or for those who would represent prisoners in staged scenes. The privatization of spectacle turned shame into sustained revenue. Yet a central paradox emerges. The same visibility that enforced domination also produced records that could undo it.
By forcing acts into the public sphere, the state inadvertently created evidence. Placards are written and then recopied. Processional routes are mapped and later etched into stone. Municipal ledgers are stored in municipal houses and occasionally fall into hands that will read them differently. Where the state sought to erase memory, its bureaucratic instruments left traces. Into that paradox steps the question of ethics and preservation. When historians, archaeologists, and curators pull a wax tablet from damp earth or peel back the plaster in an alley to photograph a scratched word, they perform an act of retrieval for which there is no simple moral equivalence. We read the past not to condemn with contemporary vocabulary, but to understand the mechanisms and to make ethical choices in the present. There are modern echoes of spectacle economies, markets of attention, platforms that monetize humiliation. But these are analogies, not equivalents. The structures are analogous in the sense that visibility can be turned into profit. They are not identical in legal, cultural, or technological terms. Still, the echoes are worth noting. Consider how a public incident today can be captured, monetized, and distributed. How brands and advertisers might harvest attention around a scandal. The scale and tools differ, but the basic logic, visibility producing value, resonates. We invoke the parallel with caution because the social and political frameworks that made Roman practices possible are different from those underpinning modern social media or legal institutions. The point is not to equate suffering across eras, but to recognize recurring dynamics, the conversion of exposure into authority and sometimes into cash. Back on the eastern road, dusk begins to lower shadows across the mile markers. Aaliyah's household is hushed. The wax tablet with its pale line is tucked into a box with broken pottery. The placard that once hung in the forum has been taken down, weathered by wind and passed between magistrates' storerooms. Someone records it in a municipal note as removed with no comment. In the theater, preparations for the next festival hum. Ropes being mended, a list of performances being checked. The captured leader's procession is scheduled for morning. Trumpets will be practiced at dawn. The convoy of enslaved people moves closer to the city gate, their footsteps making rhythms that become a city's percussion. And yet, on a scrap of paper found in a baker's shop years later, a child's hand has drawn a tiny coin with a crown and scribbled a name under it. The ledger keeper's margin notes are visible if you know where to look. A small column, a line, a half-erased correction. These pieces do not resolve the narratives, they complicate them. They suggest a future in which names might be read aloud again, in which someone will find Marginellia's notebook and reassemble the lists. They suggest that the state's attempt to make humiliation total and permanent always risked creating the very material that could testify otherwise. At the edge of the amphitheater, a municipal clerk pins a list to the wall. Names appear in cramped letters. Lysanias, son of Demos, reads one line. An entry that may be a purchase, a transfer, or a notation of debt. We cannot be absolutely certain. The document survives in a provincial copy, and scholars debate its context. But within that uncertainty lies a human truth. A name paired with an accounting entry reveals how people were folded into systems of valuation. The ledger is both instrument and archive. For now, the city keeps moving. The public scripts are being written, negotiated, and forced. The market will open tomorrow along the procession route. Stalls will be rented, vendors will hawk small commemorative items, and spectators will prepare to consume a narrative of conquest. Alia sleeps under a thin curtain, listening for the door to close. The convoy slows at a ford, the water dully reflecting chained silhouettes. The captured leader, traveling with a small retinue, will awake to the sound of trumpets that are meant to frame his fall. These scenes, domestic refusal, ritualized triumph, commercialized convoy, are not isolated oddities. They are strands in a fabric. The laws, the rituals, the markets, and the built environment are stitches that tie public humiliation to governance. And yet, beyond the visible fabric, just under its selvage, there are small threads of resistance. A scratched "remember," a marginal list of names, a child's drawing, a ledger's private column. We are moving toward a space where those marginal threads begin to tighten. Marginalia's ledger exists in a trunk sealed with wax. Rumors of its contents will circulate among a small group who meet to read aloud the names there, as if the act of reading itself is an anti-force. In another quarter, a mason will copy an inscription with added emphasis on a phrase that scholars later interpret as an act of remembrance. These moments of preservation are fragile and often only half observed. They are acts that convert the state's publicity into durable testimony. But before those private gatherings and before any formal reading can take place, the city's ritual calendar insists on its next public event. The procession route must be cleared. The amphitheater must be provisioned. Vendors settle accounts and collect their stall rent. The municipal clerk files another paper, a small slip that will be forgotten in a drawer until it resurfaces decades later. The state's apparatus will proceed as planned. And yet, the ledger waits, sealed for now, its pages whispering with names that have not yet been heard aloud in the way they will need to be to recover full dignity. The next steps will bring that ledger into play. Someone with a lamp, a reader's voice, and an audience small enough to hear and large enough to act. But that is a scene for which we are not yet prepared. For now, the city's mechanisms continue their ordinary work, making public what the state deems instructive and profitable, while small acts of memory crouch in corners waiting to be read. The tension between the public spectacle and private remembrance tightens. The amphitheater's staff tie ropes. A vendor sharpens a chisel for a plaque. A family in the suburbs adds a verse to a song that will be hummed when the procession passes. Each of these acts participates in a contested field, the state's design on the visible and the people's insistence on names. We have traced the machinery, law, ritual, market, architecture, and we have found its seams. What comes after is the moment when those seams might be pulled apart or stitched anew. The seam between public spectacle and private remembrance begins to give way in the small hours, when the market's racket becomes rumor and the city exhales. A trunk sits under a bed in a narrow room. Simple wood, iron straps, wax faint and cracked. It had been sealed with haste. The wax bears fingerprints that a careful eye has argued are not those of a clerk, but of a woman used to folding cloth. The granddaughter, call her Sibylla, though the name appears in later marginal notes and might be a reconstruction of transmission, has kept the trunk for years as if a thing could be held like a breath. She fetches a lamp, the smell of oil and old parchment bursting up like a memory. She opens the lid. The ledger inside smells of dust and grain. Its pages jitter in the lamplight, edges browned and soft. On the first visible leaf there are columns of receipts, payments for fleece, a tally for a coarse dye, a list of names tied to deaths. Between columns, in a narrow hand, someone has written short notes. Song for the road, bread to fifth pen, Lysanias? And beneath that, a line with a faint smudge that appears, to Sybilla's trained eye, like a name. Alia. The ink is thin. The letters are hurried. Whether this was Marginellia's original hand or a later reader's insertion is debated. A scholar who saw photographs of the page called the hand post-contemporary, and another argued the ink's composition indicates a 17th-year provincial clerk. We do not resolve this here. The page exists. The marks exist. The act of reading them aloud will be decisive. Sybilla calls a handful of neighbors. They meet in the back room of a pottery cellar. The room is small enough that every whisper becomes a decision. Someone brings a stool. Someone else closes the shutters. At first, the reading is pragmatic. Names, amounts, dates. Then the cadence changes. The reader pauses at a column marked Gifts, reading, Bread given to the fifth pen, and the room breathes differently. Small sounds, an intake, a pressed throat, remap the ledger into a litany. Where the municipal ledgers had turned people into rows of credit and debit, Marginalia's pages insist on connective acts. Who gave bread? Who hummed a song? Who crossed the road to speak to a man in chains? These are not mere receipts. They are a human geography. When the reader gets to the list where Alia's name might sit, the lamp trembles. The voice says the letters as best it can. Alia, refusal noted, placard shorn. The words are spare and clinical, an echo of municipal language. But the small note in a different ink, remember, lands like a small dagger of tenderness. A granddaughter closes her hand as if to keep the sound from flying away. The room begins to furnish itself with recollections. A neighbor's mother who once refused a magistrate's favor. An uncle who hummed a certain tune when a procession came by. A child's toy coin with a crudely drawn crown stashed in a chest. The ledger has drawn a new audience. The act of reading has transformed accounting into narrative. This reading is an intervention. It does not, by itself, undo the municipal ledger's power. It does not make creditors forgive debts or magistrates remove a placard retroactively. But it alters the semantic field. Names move from columns of liability into human utterance. I remember them, says someone in the circle, not as a proclamation of juridical force, but as a ritual, an ethical act of naming. The phrase is at once simple and radical. In a world where state mechanisms made visibility into control, saying the names aloud is to refuse that control's finality. It is a small ceremony of revaluation. The amphitheater's ropes tighten the next morning. Preparations continue as if none of this mattered. The city's apparatus is patient and systematic. The market runs on schedules and the state on calendars. Vendors line up for their stalls along the Triumph route. A cart arrives carrying bundles of painted tokens, little discs with stamped images, possibly the likeness of the bound leader. A contractor calls to his assistant about payment terms. The municipal clerk initials another sheet. The archival record is abundant in these routine details: payments for banners, a docket for the hire of extra hands, a notation of privileged viewing fee. Scholars cite a provincial clerk's list, a later copy, and to be taken with caution, that itemizes payments to craftsmen for festival paraphernalia. The notation helps reconstruct how the commerce of spectacle moved from large to small, from banners to trinkets to a child's toy coin tucked into a pocket.
It is possible, perhaps even likely, that the captured leader, whose face, in coins and painted plaques, appears both nameless and vividly staged, survived the public shaming precisely because he was useful alive. One provincial inscription, fragmentary and subject to alternative readings, suggests that certain captives were retained for subsequent educational displays.
Another source, a rhetorical account written generations later and colored with imperial glorification, emphasizes execution as the lesson. The truth may be a mixture. Scholars debate the endpoints. What remains clear is ritual function. The captive's body, bound and exhibited, taught a civic lesson. The object's afterlife, tokens and tales, translated that lesson into the intimate spheres of children's games and household narratives. Back with the convoy, the reading of Marginalia's pages returns again and again to names that municipal ledgers had reduced to entries. Lysanias, son of Demos, appears in a cramped column. The provincial copy that survives has been damaged along its left margin. In one recreation, the entry is a transport note, in another, a sale. Both reconstructions agree that a person bearing the name was associated with a transaction. Sibylla reads the line aloud, and the room's geometry changes. People notice the patronymic. Son of Demos provides a link to a household, a possibility of remnant kin. Someone in the circle knows of a pottery mark used by a Demos in a neighboring village. The ledger's small clinical hand connects to local memory. People begin to cross-reference. The accountant's columns are thin bridges back to persons. The city is not monolithic in its capacity to enforce. Some magistrates used humiliation as a precise administrative tool. Others used it carelessly. The state's choreography required cooperation from local markets and fellow citizens. This is both the system's strength and its vulnerability. The very mechanics that made shame visible, placards, announced edicts, public inscriptions, also created the records that could later be read as counterscript. A civic narrative, once enforced in the open square, might be countered by private readings in a room smelling of lamp oil and bread. The materiality of record-keeping, wax tablets, municipal ledgers, scratched plaster, makes possible a form of dissent precisely because it is concrete. You cannot erase an object by decree without engaging in further acts that would themselves leave traces. The reading circle grows into a modest public that is neither institution nor mob. They hold the ledger up against the window at dusk, letting light reveal ink faded across margins. They stitch cloth banners with names and sing the old tunes shuffled beneath the procession's footsteps. The act of memorializing is improvised but intentional. One woman copies the lists onto a long strip of cloth. Another transcribes a column into a child's primer. There is an economy here, not the state's market economy, but a moral economy of attention, in which attention itself becomes currency. Names acquire weight through repetition. Outside, life continues. Merchants hawk reproductions of the triumph. A baker prices a batch of pastry against the cost of flour. The convoy passes through a ford, and for a moment the water mirrors a procession of burdened silhouettes.
The cohorts of laborers who build arches and mend ropes continue their work, indifferent to naming. Yet the ledger's ripple touches even day labor. A man who carried one of the beads for a vendor recognizes a name and hesitates, hands empty for once. These small pauses are the only kind of protest available to many. A refusal to look away, a slowing of the business-as-usual motion, a whispered alteration of what will be sold and remembered. There is no clean juridical redress. The municipal clerk refuses to remove a placard retroactively. Record-keeping was not designed for reversal. But the ledger's circulation creates social pressure. A few stallholders quietly decide to accept the stitches of the memory cloth as barter. Where the state's grip seeks to make humiliation into a durable barrier, social gestures, bread given, songs sung, names read, become forms of repair. They do not annul past injuries, they assert that injury will not be the last word. The captured leader's image begins to appear in unexpected places. A craftsman who once sold discs stamped with a bound figure repurposes his die to print images of a seated figure with no crown. The change might be aesthetic, or it might be sympathy. We cannot read motive from the artifact alone. But the object, once a crude souvenir of triumph, becomes ambiguous. A fragmentary inscription on a reused stone, recorded by a mason and later copied by an antiquarian, renders a phrase that is contested in translation, not only for victory, a construction some scholars think was later interpolation. Whether such transformations were intentional acts of resistance or simple economic adaptation, they matter. Objects meant to commodify shame can be subtly altered, their semiotics redirected by hands that handle them later. Marginalia's ledger becomes both repository and cure. The pages show erasures, ink blots, a deliberate crossing out where a name has been scored and then reanimated with a marginal remember. The ledger shows petty acts of decency as entries: the purchase of extra bread for the 5th pen, a donation for bath tokens in the amphitheater's vicinity. In one margin, Sibylla finds a tiny, childlike sketch, a crude coin with a crown and a name under it, drawn by a hand that might be a child's. The sketch suggests that the triumph's narrative had been, even in its propagation, picked up and transformed by small domestic acts. These small acts accumulate into a practice of commemoration that is not purely oppositional. Reading the ledger out loud, stitching names into cloth, singing a verse, these are social acts that demand attention. They do not confront the magistrate directly. They reconfigure the communal memory. In doing so, they place the burden of moral reckoning back in the public square, not by decree, but by repetition. Historians who study these materials stress caution. Many of the documents are late copies or fragmentary reconstructions.
The wax tablet attributed to Alia, for instance, survives in a plinth found in a backroom excavation and may have been recopied by a clerk long after the events it purports to document. A paleographer might argue that the tablet's hand is not contemporary. A chemist may point to ink composition as indicating anachrony. These technical disputes matter because they illuminate the documentary chain. The point is not to abandon the evidence, but to read it with calibrated skepticism. When we read Alia's name written in lamp-dark ink, we do so knowing both the possibility of error and the human reality that a person once carried the weight of a placard. And still, within the ledger's pages, details emerge that anchor speculation. A line reads, "Song for the road," next to a tally of coins. Who hummed the song? Was it a neighbor or a child? Was the coin a bribe or a token of aid? We cannot always say. But the placement suggests a network of small solidarities. The city's apparatus sliced lives into lines of credit and public marking. The ledger's margins reassemble those lines into gestures. It is a practice of attention recorded in ink. At the scene of the amphitheater, the morning of the procession arrives clear and bright. The crowd's murmurs thin into a hush as trumpets set a tone. The captured leader is led past arches, eyes lowered. His body is made to tell a story. The spectacle is efficient in its communicative work. But a crowd is never a single mind. There are those who buy tokens and keep them as proof of presence. There are also those who secure a child's hand to their arm and, on the return from the spectacle, teach a name in a low voice. The rituals of consumption and commemoration are messy and intertwined. Later, the ledger-reading community stages a small public act. It is not a riot or a formal petition. It is a reading aloud in the marketplace square on a day that is otherwise unremarkable. They do so quietly, arranging themselves near the fountain where a placard once hung. A municipal clerk notices and takes note in his ledger. In his marginalia, he writes, "Reading, public." Whether his note will survive and how it will be used is uncertain. But the action is bold in its ordinariness. Names read in a public tavern, clothes dyed with the ledger's ink, a child's small coin tied to a string bearing a stitched name.
The act complicates the city's choreography. It does not overturn it, but adds a layer. This is the ledger reading moment as moral pivot. The pronouncement, "I remember them," migrates from private murmurs to a communal ritual. The utterance accumulates a new force because it is shared. The effect is not immediate political reversal. Rather, it is a social revaluation. Names that once functioned as liabilities in municipal columns become markers of belonging. They are carried home in songs, sewn into hymns, and whispered between generations.
Memory becomes resistance precisely because it insists on another kind of currency: attention, repetition, narrative. From the vantage of the state's institutions, this practice is hard to suppress decisively without resorting to still more public acts that would leave further records. That paradox, where erasure requires action that itself produces more evidence, has long been a discomfort for administrations whose control depends on making shame absolute. The municipal machinery could enforce, but each enforcement leaves traces: orders written and signed, carts requisitioned, payments made. Those traces become the very things that a ledger keeper or a granddaughter can find and read. This does not mean the ledger or its readings resolve the underlying injustices. Enslaved people remained enslaved. Captives might continue to be used in displays. Alia's economic hardship likely endured. But the ledger's circulation shows that memory is not only archival, it is performative. To remember aloud is to create a moral topology in which certain acts, selling humiliation for profit, annotating a person as defaulted in civic duty, are visible and contestable. The modern spectator watching this ancient drama must tread carefully. It is tempting to draw direct lines between these Roman spectacles and contemporary forms of mediated shaming. There are echoes: how attention can be monetized, how stories are packaged and sold, how humiliation can be a resource for some. But these are analogies, not identities. The legal and cultural frameworks that enabled Roman humiliations are not the same as those that shape modern digital economies. The instruments differ: wax tablets versus databases, amphitheaters versus platforms. The ethical questions, however, reverberate. When a society turns exposure into value, what protections exist for the exposed? Who profits, and at what human cost? We must also ask what it means to preserve names. Preservation is not a neutral act. Recovering a name like Lysanias or Alia is moral work. It imposes responsibility: to read carefully, to acknowledge uncertainty, to resist sensationalism, to avoid using recovered names as mere props in modern controversies. Preserving memory requires curatorial humility. It demands that we mark contested lines as contested, and that we indicate when a source is a later copy or subject to interpretation. The ledger's authority is not absolute. It is a provocation to ethical attention. There is a way in which the very techniques that turned people into public lessons, architecture, law, marketization, also produced the material culture necessary for remembrance. Plinths, plaques, tablets, coins, items produced for the spectacle, survive in the soil. The state's own need to make things legible, to inscribe victories and penalties, created the archives that strangers centuries later will open. This is a structural irony, an archival paradox. A state's appetite for legibility becomes the historian's access point for dissent. It does not absolve the state's acts. It merely shows that bureaucracies are not monochromatic. They create records, and records can be reread. As dusk gathers once more over the city, Sibylla and the reading circle stitch a final cloth. It holds a handful of names, written in ink and thread. They hang it in a low place near the fountain, a visible but humble spot, not a public placard nailed to the magistrate's podium. It will not change official status.
It will, however, be visible to anyone who draws water in the morning. Its physical presence is quiet but persistent. It is an ethical intervention in the texture of daily life. Word of the reading travels slowly beyond the neighborhood. A merchant who once sold trumpets sees a name on the cloth and remembers an old story told by his father. He begins to hum a line that matches a fragment in Marginalia's margin. A child who plays with a toy coin stumbles upon a scratched "Remember" on plaster and shows it to a teacher, who records it in a small notebook and passes the note to a clerk in another quarter. A provincial antiquarian hears rumors and later copies a page of the ledger into an album. Each of these acts adds another layer of testimony. The state's instruments have, unwittingly, produced multiple modes of memory that outlast their original intentions. At the center of this narrative, Alia's fate remains partly unresolved. The ledger gives us glances: a note of bread, a placard, a shorn head. The municipal accounts show the entry that marked her as in default of civic duties. Beyond that, sources diverge. Some later records suggest that women in similar positions found ways to migrate to other towns where anonymity gave room for new lives. Other fragmentary accounts imply continued marginalization. We cannot say with certainty which path Alia walked. Indefinito. What the ledger and the reading offer, however, is a restoration of presence. Where civic accounting sought to render her reputation into a durable liability, those who named her aloud transformed her into a person whose memory required others to act. The captured leader's image, too, becomes complicated in the aftermath. Coins circulate that replicate his bound visage. Then other items appear that lack the triumphant captions. A potter repurposes an image. A singer composes a new verse with a slightly altered moral. The leader's fate in the official record is ambiguous. Some later rhetorical accounts claim an execution timed to the state's propaganda. Other, more mundane administrative notes indicate transfer to custody, perhaps further spectacle, perhaps long-term imprisonment. Indefinito remains our honest historian's response. Yet the important point is this: the leader's staged humiliation did not ensure a single stable memory.
Multiple narrators, vendors, scribes, neighbors created competing scripts. The convoy's human cargo left a different kind of trace. For some, the ledger provides a genealogical thread, a patronymic here, a mark of origin there. For others, only silence. But even silence is resistant when a descendant finds a name on a cloth, when a song reproduces a small detail, when a modern reader connects a potter's mark to a household archive. Names become nodes through which people reconstitute kinship. The act of remembering, then, is reparative in small ways. It restores associations that the state's ledgers tried to collapse. We arrive, finally, at the ethical charge that must close a tale such as this. Visibility can be a weapon. So too can it be a witness. The Roman mechanisms we have traced, laws that authorize marking, ritual choreography, market incentives that commodify spectacle, architecture that choreographs sight, were designed to teach civic lessons and to reinforce hierarchies. They were effective because they enlisted ordinary people, vendors who profited from tokens, neighbors who would read a placard and change a household behavior, craftsmen who supplied an image that children would later play with. Yet those same materials, wax, ink, stone, enabled small acts of counter-memory. Memory is not only archival, it is relational and performative. For those watching from our own era, there is an obligation that follows from this history. Preservation is not neutral. When we recover names, when we display artifacts, when we narrate old events for a present audience, we accept responsibility for framing. The ethical historian must mark uncertainty, resist sensationalism, and humanize victims without rendering them into moral fodder.
The modern echoes, attention economies, monetized shaming, spectacle for profit, are instructive as parallels, but they must be treated with nuance. Similarities of logic do not equate to sameness of institution. To draw analogies is to highlight recurring dynamics, not to flatten historical difference. What can we do with the memory the ledger offers? First, we can listen. We can preserve the names with accuracy and humility. We can contextualize uncertainty where it exists. We can make space for the small acts that resist commodification. Reading names aloud, copying them into domestic textiles, singing the verses that refuse to be merely entertainment. We can also examine contemporary practices that instrumentally exploit humiliation and ask whether legal and social safeguards are adequate to prevent the conversion of exposure into profit, at human expense. In the end, the ledger's pages are simple things, ink on fibers, lines across a folio. But in those plain materials resides a powerful claim, that to remember is to act on behalf of those whose lives were public property. Sibylla's reading did not confiscate the state's power. It reallocated moral attention.
It taught a neighborhood to carry a burden of responsibility toward the names it had helped forget. That lesson is small but consequential. Memory, once practiced, changes communal expectations. The road east of the city continues to carry carts and feet. The amphitheater's silhouette remains on the skyline. Ropes are mended and banners rolled for the next cycle of public display. Markets hum and vendors mend tokens for sale. The machinery of spectacle is not easily dismantled. Yet, tucked in a back room and held next to a lamp, a ledger persists. It gathers names. It insists. If there is a final image to take away from this account, let it be this. A hand places a small cloth with stitched names on the edge of a fountain. A child stoops to peer, fingers cold, eyes curious. The child's aunt hums a half-remembered tune that mentions a name. The sound crosses the square and, for a moment, complicates the official script. The state's placards remain. The amphitheater will open. Markets will profit. But memory has been activated as a public practice. It is not a cure-all. It is a civic tool, fragile, persistent, demanding attention. Remembering is not simply an act of retrieval. It is an ethical stance. It requires care with evidence, acknowledgement of uncertainty, and an insistence on human dignity. It asks us to keep company with names that the apparatus of spectacle once tried to convert into mere instruction. It asks us to preserve, not as curiosities, but as persons, the traces left by empire. If you found these stories important, subscribe and share to help preserve these names and insist we don't let spectacle become currency again.